A nurse bought dinner for a homeless teen crying outside a diner, but the next day, she discovered his family was waiting for her at the hospital. What happened in those 24 hours that changed everything? Stay tuned to uncover a story of unexpected connections and life-changing moments. And hey, where are you watching this from? Share it in the comments below. Eliza pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, the biting December wind slicing through Asheville's streets like icy needles. Holiday lights adorned the lampposts, casting a warm glow over the snow-blanketed sidewalks, but she barely noticed. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of exhaustion after a grueling double shift at the hospital. She had wanted to get home early to rest, maybe catch up on bills or the countless other chores that demanded her attention. But tonight, like so many others, had drained her. As she passed a small, warmly lit diner, she paused. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure huddled by the door. A teenage boy, wrapped in a threadbare coat, trembling against the cold. His face, pale and gaunt, was partially obscured by shaggy hair. But what struck her was the way he clutched a torn photograph. The desperation in his eyes reminded her of patients she had seen teetering on the edge of hope and despair. For a moment, she hesitated. What would Mom have done? The thought of her late mother, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, no matter the personal cost, flooded her mind. Eliza tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, trying to dismiss the pull in her chest. I'm too tired for this, she told herself. But the image of the boy didn't leave her. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she approached cautiously. Hey, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You okay? The boy stiffened, his eyes darting to hers with a mix of suspicion and fear. I'm fine, he mumbled, his words barely audible over the sound of the wind. You don't look fine, Eliza countered, glancing at the diner's window. Inside, families laughed and ate, oblivious to the world outside. You're freezing. Let me get you something warm to eat. I don't need charity, he snapped, pulling the photograph closer to his chest. His voice cracked, revealing more vulnerability than defiance. Eliza crouched slightly to meet his gaze. It's not charity, it's just food, and maybe a little conversation, if you're up for it. His eyes lingered on hers for a beat longer than she expected before he finally nodded, the slightest of movements. Fine. They stepped into the diner where the smell of coffee and freshly baked pies enveloped them. Eliza guided him to a corner booth where he immediately hunched over as if trying to make himself invisible. She ordered a hot chocolate and a bowl of soup, her eyes flicking back to him as she waited. I'm Eliza, she offered once the waitress left. The boy hesitated, his hands still clutching the photograph. Fletcher, he said finally. Nice to meet you, Fletcher. You've been out here long? He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the table. Long enough. The hot chocolate arrived, steam curling into the air between them. Fletcher wrapped his hands around the mug as if savoring the warmth more than the drink itself. For a while, neither spoke, the hum of the diner filling the silence. Then, out of nowhere, he muttered, I'm better off alone. Eliza's heart tightened. She had heard those words before, from herself, on nights when the loneliness felt too heavy, but she had never believed it about anyone else. Why do you say that? She asked gently. He shook his head, unwilling or unable to explain. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the torn photograph. He held it out slightly, as if offering her a glimpse before pulling it back. This is all I have left of them, he said, his voice cracking. Eliza leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. The photograph showed a smiling family in front of what looked like an old wooden bridge. It was creased and worn, as if it had been handled 1,000 times. Who are they? She asked softly. Fletcher didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tucked the photo back into his coat and turned his gaze to the window, his reflection blending with the falling snow. They're gone, he said finally. That's all that matters. But his voice betrayed him. Beneath the words was a raw, unspoken pain that pulled at Eliza's heart. Sometimes, she began, choosing her words carefully, the hardest thing is letting someone else help. But it's also the bravest. Fletcher didn't reply, but his hands tightened around the mug, his knuckles white against the porcelain. As they sat in silence, Eliza knew one thing for certain. She couldn't just walk away. Not now. The steam from Fletcher's untouched hot chocolate swirled upward, disappearing into the diner's ambient light. Eliza leaned forward, her elbows resting gently on the worn formica table, her gaze fixed on the boy across from her. The photograph he clutched had caught her attention, creased and torn, its edges softened by time. It wasn't just an image, it was a lifeline, a tether to a story he wasn't ready to share. "Fletcher," she began carefully, her voice soft but firm, "about the photo. Who are they?" He didn't look up. His fingers traced the worn edges of the picture, his shoulders hunched as if to shield it from view. "It doesn't matter," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It matters to you," Eliza pressed gently. "You wouldn't carry it around if it didn't." Fletcher finally glanced up, his eyes sharp with a mix of suspicion and sorrow. "They're my family," he admitted, his tone guarded. "Or, they were." He let the words hang in the air like fragile glass, daring her to break them. Eliza nodded slowly, letting the silence settle before speaking again. "You don't have to tell me everything, but if there's something I can do—" "You can't," Fletcher interrupted, his voice rising with sudden intensity. "They're gone because of me. It's my fault." The words hit her like a gust of cold wind, carrying the weight of a guilt far too heavy for someone so young. "Fletcher, I don't believe that," she said firmly, her tone steady but kind. "Whatever happened, it wasn't your fault. Families don't work like that." His laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "You don't know that. You don't know anything about me." Eliza leaned back slightly, giving him space but refusing to back down. "You're right," she admitted. "I don't know everything, but I do know what it's like to feel alone, to think you don't deserve help." She paused, her own memories flashing briefly before her eyes. "I also know that's not true, not for you, not for anyone." Fletcher's gaze dropped to the table again, his fingers tightening around the photo. "They'd be better off without me," he muttered. "They probably already are." Eliza's heart ached at his words, but she kept her focus. "What makes you think that?" He hesitated, then pushed the photo across the table. She picked it up carefully, studying the image. A smiling family stood in front of a picturesque wooden bridge, their joy frozen in time. In the corner of the picture, faint handwriting caught her attention, almost imperceptible but unmistakably there. She squinted, leaning closer. "There's something written here," she said, more to herself than to him. Fletcher's head snapped up, his expression wary. "It's nothing," he said quickly, reaching for the photo. Eliza held it just out of reach, her curiosity piqued. "It looks like an address, or a name," she murmured. "What is this?" Fletcher sat back, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything." "Fletcher," Eliza said, her voice steady but insistent. "If this is a clue about where your family might be, don't you think it's worth checking out?" His hands balled into fists, the tension in his frame palpable. "You don't get it," he said, his voice breaking. "If they wanted me, they'd have found me by now." "Or maybe they're looking and they don't know where to start," Eliza countered. "Maybe they need you to meet them halfway." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Reassurance, understanding, perhaps even hope. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the diner's fluorescent lights. Finally, he exhaled, the fight draining from his posture. "Fine," he said quietly. "We'll go, but I'm telling you now, you won't like what you find." Eliza nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Let's find out together." As they left the diner, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, coating the streets in a pristine layer of white. Fletcher walked a step behind her, his head low, the photograph tucked safely back into his coat. Eliza glanced back at him, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Whatever they were about to uncover, she knew one thing for certain. This fragile bond was the first step in a much longer journey. The crunch of snow beneath their feet echoed in the cold, quiet night, as Eliza and Fletcher trudged through the streets of Asheville. The address scrawled on the back of the photograph had led them to the edge of town, where holiday lights grew sparser, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. Fletcher walked with his head down, his breath visible in short, uneven bursts. The torn photo remained tucked securely in his coat, but its weight seemed to drag him further into himself with each step. "You're awfully quiet," Eliza said, glancing at him as they turned a corner. "You sure you're up for this?" Fletcher shrugged, kicking at a chunk of snow that had hardened into ice. "I just don't want you to think this is going to fix anything," he muttered. "Whatever we find, it's probably not good." Eliza slowed her pace, falling into step beside him. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But isn't it better to know?" Sometimes answers, no matter how hard, are the first step to healing. He didn't respond, but the slight furrow of his brow betrayed the storm brewing in his mind. She didn't press him further. Instead, she let the silence settle, hoping the crisp air and their shared determination would ease the tension. The shelter came into view moments later, a modest building with warm golden light spilling from its windows. A faded sign above the door read, "St. Thomas Refuge." Fletcher froze at the edge of the parking lot, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. "We're here," Eliza said gently. "Whenever you're ready." He hesitated, his weight shifting between his feet. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice barely audible. Eliza stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Fletcher. We'll do it together." After a long pause, he nodded, his movements stiff but resolute. They walked inside, the warmth of the building a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. A woman behind the reception desk looked up, her expression softening as she noticed them. "Welcome to St. Thomas," she said, her voice kind. "How can I help you?" Fletcher glanced at Eliza, who stepped forward. "We're looking for information," she explained, "about a family who might have been here recently." She gestured to Fletcher. "He's been separated from them." The woman's face clouded with concern. "Do you have any details, names, dates, anything that could help us look into it?" Fletcher hesitated, then slowly pulled the photograph from his coat. He handed it over with visible reluctance, his fingers lingering on the edges as if letting it go was a betrayal. The woman studied it closely. "I recognize this place," she said, pointing to the wooden bridge in the background. "That's just a few miles from here." She turned the photo over, her eyes narrowing at the handwriting. "This address? Yes, they were here, I remember them." Fletcher's head shot up, his eyes wide. "They were?" She nodded, though her expression grew somber. "They stayed for a while, but they had to leave. Something about delays with their case. It happens sometimes, unfortunately." "Where did they go?" Eliza pressed. "I wish I could say," the woman admitted. "But I do remember them asking about you." She looked at Fletcher, her gaze filled with quiet sympathy. "They left a message, hoping you'd find it. Let me check our lost and found. It might still be there." As she disappeared into the back room, Fletcher stood motionless, his hands curling into fists. "They were here," he murmured, his voice thick with a mix of anger and disbelief. "And I missed them." "Hey," Eliza said, stepping in front of him. "This isn't over. We're closer now than we were before." Before he could respond, the woman returned, holding a small, battered toy bunny. Its fur was matted, and one of its ears hung limply, but Fletcher's face crumpled at the sight of it. "This belonged to your sister," the woman said softly. "She held on to it the entire time they were here. When they had to leave, she insisted we keep it safe for you." Fletcher took the toy with trembling hands, pressing it against his chest. His breath hitched, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might collapse under the weight of his emotions. She placed a steadying hand on his back, offering silent support. "They were looking for you, Fletcher," Eliza said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "They haven't given up, and neither should you." He nodded slowly, tears slipping down his cheeks as he clung to the toy. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "What if they blame me? What if they hate me?" Eliza crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "What if they've been waiting for you this whole time?" she countered. "What if this is the moment everything starts to get better?" Before Fletcher could respond, the receptionist hesitated. "There's one more thing," she said, her tone uneasy. "The name Silas came up in their case. He's known to cause delays in situations like this." Eliza frowned. "Silas, who's that?" The woman hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "Let's just say he's part of the system, and not the good part." Fletcher's grip tightened on the bunny. "If he's the reason my family isn't here," he said, his voice steady despite the tears, "then we're going to find him." Eliza nodded, her resolve mirroring his. "We'll figure this out, Fletcher, one step at a time." As they left the shelter, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white. But this time, Fletcher walked a little taller, the toy bunny clutched tightly in his arms and a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. The municipal office loomed ahead, its gray, imposing facade framed by bare trees and patches of unshoveled snow. Fletcher hesitated at the curb, clutching the toy bunny tightly against his chest. Eliza placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression firm but kind. "We're doing this together," she said. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Fletcher nodded reluctantly, his jaw tightening as they pushed through the heavy glass doors into the warmth of the building. Inside, the atmosphere was clinical and cold. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over rows of desks, and the low hum of printers filled the air. A few clerks moved mechanically behind counters, their faces blank with exhaustion. At the far end of the room, a man with a stern expression and a stiff posture sat behind a desk, his nameplate reading Silas Morton. His presence was imposing, even from a distance. "That must be him," Eliza murmured, nudging Fletcher forward. "Let's go." They approached cautiously, but Silas noticed them before they could speak. He looked up with a sharp, impatient glare. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Eliza straightened, her resolve hardening under his gaze. "We're here about Fletcher's case. His family was at St. Thomas Refuge, and we need to know what happened, why they had to leave." Silas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Ah, another one of those cases," he said, his voice laced with thinly veiled disdain. "Look, I understand you're concerned, but these things take time. The system is overburdened." "That doesn't explain why his family was forced to leave," Eliza pressed, her voice firm. "They were trying to reunite with him. You had the power to help, and you didn't." Silas's eyes narrowed. "I suggest you watch your tone, miss." "Eliza," she replied evenly. "And I'm not leaving until we get some answers." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably beside her, his fists clenched. "They were looking for me," he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "You let them slip away." "Why?" Silas glanced at Fletcher, his expression unreadable. "Do you know how many cases like this cross my desk every day? Hundreds. I can't prioritize one over the others just because someone's feelings are hurt." Eliza took a step closer to the desk, her eyes blazing. "This isn't about feelings. It's about a family trying to stay together, and you chose not to help." Silas's facade cracked just slightly, a flicker of something, bitterness perhaps, crossing his face. "You think this is easy?" he snapped. "I've spent years fighting for a system that doesn't care. It's broken, and people like you come in here expecting miracles." "It's not a miracle we're asking for," Eliza retorted. "It's basic human decency." Before Silas could respond, a younger clerk approached cautiously, glancing nervously between the two. "Mr. Morton," she said quietly, holding out a file. "I found this. It might be related to their case." Silas took the file, flipping through it with a dismissive air. "It's irrelevant," he muttered, shoving it aside. Eliza caught the clerk's eye and saw a flicker of sympathy. "What's in the file?" she asked, her tone softening. The clerk hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's an address," she whispered. "I think it's where the family went after St. Thomas. But you didn't hear that from me." Eliza nodded gratefully, her hand brushing Fletcher's arm. "We'll follow up," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." The clerk gave her a brief, tight-lipped smile before retreating. Silas, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, his expression icy. "If you think you can fix this," he said slowly, "you're more naive than I thought." "Maybe," Eliza replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But at least I'm trying." As they turned to leave, Silas called after them, his voice low and ominous. "You don't know what you're getting into," he warned. "If you push this, you'll regret it." Eliza paused, but didn't look back. "We'll see about that," she said, her tone resolute. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces, but Fletcher seemed lighter, more determined. "Do you think this address will lead us to them?" he asked, his voice tinged with cautious hope. Eliza nodded, pulling her coat tighter around her. "It's a start, and right now that's enough." The two walked down the snowy street together, the file clutched tightly in Eliza's hand, and the faint glow of a street lamp illuminating their path. Unbeknownst to them, Silas watched from the office window, his jaw clenched and his mind racing. Whatever they were chasing, he wasn't going to make it easy for them. The night was cold and still as Eliza and Fletcher trudged through the slushy streets of Asheville, the address from the clerk clutched tightly in Eliza's hand. Fletcher's face was set in a mask of apprehension, his shoulders hunched against the chill. Despite her own weariness, Eliza managed a reassuring smile, her breath puffing in white clouds as she spoke. "This is progress," she said, her voice steady. Every step gets us closer." Fletcher didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement beneath his feet. The words of Silas still echoed in his mind, mingling with his own gnawing doubts. What if this was all for nothing? What if his family had already given up on him? They arrived at the shelter, a modest brick building nestled at the edge of town. Strings of multicolored lights hung haphazardly around the entrance, flickering in a way that hinted at faulty wiring. The faint hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes drifted through the door as Eliza pushed it open. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of warmth and chaos. Families huddled around tables, children darted between chairs, and volunteers moved briskly with trays of food. Fletcher lingered near the door, his eyes darting nervously from one face to another, searching for the impossible. Eliza gently guided him to the reception desk, where a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile greeted them. Her name tag read, Linda. "Hi there," Eliza began, her tone polite but firm. "We're looking for information about a family who might have stayed here recently. They were at St. Thomas Refuge before this." Linda's expression softened as she glanced at Fletcher. "I do remember a family like that," she said. "A mother, a younger sister, but they couldn't stay long. We were overcrowded, and there just wasn't enough space." She sighed, her voice tinged with regret. "It's heartbreaking, but we had no choice." Fletcher flinched at the words, his hands tightening into fists. Eliza placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "Do you know where they went?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Linda hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I don't. They left with almost nothing, except hope that they'd find him." Her gaze lingered on Fletcher, her eyes filled with sympathy. Nearby, a volunteer sorting through the lost and found box held up a worn photograph. "This was left behind a few weeks ago. Is this theirs?" Fletcher stepped forward, his breath catching as he recognized the smiling faces of his mother and sister. His fingers trembled as he took the photo, a flood of memories washing over him, the warmth of home, the sound of his sister's laughter, the sense of belonging he thought he'd lost forever. Eliza watched him carefully, her own heart aching at the vulnerability etched on his face. "This means they're still looking for you," she said gently. "We're on the right track." Fletcher's grip on the photo tightened, his voice barely above a whisper. What if they're better off without me?" "Don't say that," Eliza replied, her tone firm but kind. "Families go through hard times, but it doesn't mean they stop loving each other. I lost my mom a few years ago, and there were days I felt like giving up. But she taught me that no matter how hard things get, you keep going, for the people you love." Fletcher's eyes glistened, but he quickly looked away, his walls still partially intact. Before Eliza could say more, Linda returned with a folded piece of paper. She leaned in close, her voice barely audible over the noise of the shelter. "There's a holiday event at the community center tomorrow," she said. "Sometimes families who can't find shelter gather there. It's a long shot, but it might be worth checking out." Eliza nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave, Fletcher froze in place, his attention drawn to a hushed conversation between two staff members near the kitchen. He strained to hear, his heart pounding as one of them mentioned a familiar name. "Silas Morton. He's been meddling with the reunifications again. It's disgraceful," one of them muttered. Fletcher's stomach twisted in anger and disbelief. He turned to Eliza, his voice barely controlled. "They're talking about Silas. He's not just part of the problem, he's causing it." Eliza's jaw tightened, her mind racing. "We'll deal with that later," she said, her voice steady. "Right now, let's focus on finding your family." As they stepped back into the cold night, Fletcher clutched the photograph like a lifeline. The faint glow of the community center's lights in the distance was their next destination. But the shadow of Silas's interference loomed larger than ever. The morning was icy, the sun casting a cold, pale light across the snow-covered streets as Eliza and Fletcher walked briskly toward the community center. Fletcher, clutching the photograph he'd found at the shelter, was quieter than usual. His footsteps shuffled and he glanced nervously at Eliza. What if they're not there?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Eliza paused, looking at him with a reassuring smile. "Then we keep searching. You're not alone in this, Fletcher." Before he could respond, Eliza's phone buzzed in her pocket. She answered quickly, the concerned voice of Linda from the shelter filling the line. "Eliza, you need to know. Silas has issued an order. He's shutting down several shelters, including ours. Claims there are violations. What? Violations of what? Eliza's voice sharpened. Linda hesitated. He's vague, as always, but it's bad. This could ruin us. Eliza ended the call, her jaw tightening as she turned to Fletcher. Change of plans. We need to figure out what Silas is doing, and fast. Fletcher's brow furrowed. Why does he care so much about shutting people down? It's like he doesn't want anyone to get help. That's exactly what we're going to find out, Eliza said, her voice firm. They made their way to the municipal office, where Silas's name seemed to hang like a storm cloud over the building. Inside, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Eliza approached the reception desk, her usual polite demeanor edged with determination. I need to see Silas Morton, she said. The clerk looked up, her expression guarded. He's busy. It's important, Eliza pressed, leaning slightly closer. Lives are at stake. After a long pause, the clerk relented, gesturing toward the hallway. Room 314. As they walked toward the office, Fletcher's anxiety bubbled to the surface. What if this makes things worse? What if he... Eliza stopped, placing a hand on his shoulder. Fletcher, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes standing up to people like Silas is the only way to make a difference. When they entered Silas's office, the man barely glanced up from his paperwork. His expression was as cold as the winter wind outside. Miss Hayes, he said dryly. What a surprise. I heard about your orders, Eliza began, her tone measured but firm. Shutting down shelters during the coldest months of the year, it's cruel, even for you. Silas leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The system is overwhelmed, Miss Hayes. If some shelters are out of compliance, it's my duty to address that. We can't have chaos. Chaos! Eliza's voice rose. You're endangering lives. Fletcher, standing slightly behind her, couldn't hold back. You're not helping anyone. You're just making it harder for families like mine to find each other. For the briefest moment, Silas's icy demeanor cracked. His eyes flickered with something. Regret? Pain? But it was gone just as quickly. You don't know what you're talking about, kid, he said, his tone dismissive. Eliza narrowed her eyes. We know you're not just enforcing rules, Silas. What's really going on? Silas's lips pressed into a thin line. I suggest you tread carefully, Miss Hayes. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. His words hung in the air as Fletcher stared him down. We're not afraid of you, Fletcher said, his voice trembling but resolute. Silas smirked, but there was no humor in it. That's your mistake. Before Eliza could respond, the clerk from earlier slipped into the office, a bundle of papers clutched to her chest. She avoided Silas's gaze as she approached Eliza, her voice barely above a whisper. You might want to look at these. Eliza took the papers, her eyes scanning the documents quickly. Her breath caught as she realized what she was holding. Records of financial discrepancies tied directly to Silas's name. Large sums of money had been funneled out of the shelter system, leaving it underfunded and vulnerable. Fletcher leaned over her shoulder, his eyes widening. What does this mean? It means Silas has been sabotaging the shelters from the inside, Eliza said, her voice low but seething. She turned back to Silas, holding up the documents. And now we know why. Silas stood, his face darkening. You think you've won something? You're in way over your head. Eliza's gaze didn't waver. We'll see about that. As they left the office, Fletcher looked up at her, his expression a mix of awe and uncertainty. What now? Eliza tightened her grip on the papers, her resolve hardening. Now, we fight back. The toy bunny sat on the lost and found table, its frayed ear drooping, as though it carried the weight of all the memories tied to it. Fletcher's breath hitched as he stepped closer, his fingers trembling slightly when he reached out to touch it. It's hers, he murmured, his voice barely audible. It was always with her. Eliza stood beside him, her presence steady and comforting. This is a sign, Fletcher, she said softly. We're getting closer. For a moment, Fletcher didn't move. His fingers lingered on the toy as though it might dissolve if he let go. Then he pulled his hand back and crossed his arms, his usual defensive posture returning. Or it's just another dead end, he muttered. A staff member approached cautiously, her face kind but worn. I overheard you asking about your family, she said, her voice tinged with sympathy. Your sister was here just a few days ago. Fletcher's head snapped up. She was? The woman nodded. She left a note. It's not much, but maybe it'll help. She handed Eliza a folded piece of paper. Fletcher watched silently as Eliza unfolded it, revealing a hastily scrawled message. Fletch, if you're reading this, find me at the holiday event in Montford Park. I'll wait for you. M. Fletcher's knees buckled slightly, and he sat down on a nearby bench, the note clenched in his hand. She's waiting for me, he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and fear. She's actually waiting. Eliza sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. And we're going to find her, she said firmly. But you need to believe you deserve this, Fletcher. His head dropped. What if I don't? What if she blames me for everything? Eliza took a deep breath, her own memories surfacing. When my mom passed, she began, I blamed myself for a long time. I thought if I had been there more, done more, she might have held on longer. But the truth is, none of us can carry that kind of guilt. Your sister doesn't want to blame you. She just wants her brother back. Fletcher looked at her, his eyes glassy. You think so? I know so, Eliza said, her voice unwavering. The staff member interrupted their moment, her voice low but urgent. There's something else you should know. Silas. He's been meddling with the event. I don't know why, but you need to get there soon. Fletcher's fists clenched. Why can't he just leave us alone? Eliza shook her head, her expression grim. Because people like Silas thrive on control. But he doesn't get to control this. They left the community center with renewed urgency, the snowy streets stretching out before them like a maze. As they walked, Fletcher's emotions began to spill out. I don't even know if I'll recognize her, he said suddenly. What if she's changed? What if I've changed too much? Eliza stopped and turned to face him. Do you remember the first time you met her? She asked. He nodded hesitantly. She was so tiny, I was scared I'd break her. But you didn't, Eliza said with a small smile. You held her and you loved her. That hasn't changed, Fletcher. You're still her brother. Fletcher's lips trembled, but he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Let's go. The walk to Montford Park felt endless. The holiday decorations lining the streets seemed almost mocking in their cheerfulness, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Fletcher's chest. When they finally arrived, the park was bustling with activity. Twinkling lights hung from every tree and the scent of hot cocoa filled the air. Eliza scanned the crowd, her eyes sharp. She could be anywhere, she said. Stay close to me. Fletcher nodded, his gaze darting anxiously from face to face. Every child's laughter, every woman's voice made his heart lurch with hope and dread. They approached the main event area where a small stage had been set up for carolers. But as they moved through the crowd, something caught Fletcher's eye. A man standing near the stage, his posture stiff and his gaze cold. It was Silas. Eliza followed Fletcher's line of sight and froze. He's here, she said under her breath. Before Fletcher could respond, a familiar voice rang out, carried on the chilly evening breeze. Fletch? Fletcher whipped around, his eyes widening as they landed on a young girl standing near a cluster of Christmas trees. She was holding another toy bunny, its twin, and her face was a mixture of shock and joy. M, Fletcher breathed, his voice breaking. But before he could move, Silas stepped forward, his expression dark. You're making a mistake, Miss Hayes, he said, his voice low and threatening. Eliza stepped protectively in front of Fletcher. You're the one making mistakes, Silas, and we're about to expose all of them. Fletcher's eyes darted between his sister and Silas, his heart pounding. He took a shaky step toward M, but Silas's voice stopped him cold. Think carefully, kid. You don't know what you're walking into. The weight of the moment pressed down on Fletcher like the snow-laden branches around them. His sister's hopeful eyes met his, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Fletcher, Eliza said gently, her voice cutting through the tension. It's your choice, but whatever you decide, I'll stand by you. Fletcher took a deep breath, his hand tightening around the photograph in his pocket. I'm not afraid of you, Silas, he said quietly. Not anymore. Silas's smirk faltered, but before he could respond, Fletcher stepped past him, his focus solely on the sister who had never stopped waiting for him. The vibrant holiday lights of Montford Park stretched across the snowy expanse, their warm glow casting a surreal atmosphere over the bustling festivities. Children darted between elaborately decorated trees, their laughter blending with the soft strains of a caroling choir. Vendors sold hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts, their cheerful calls punctuating the crisp winter air. Fletcher lingered at the park's edge, his breath visible in the cold. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. His gaze flitted over the crowd, landing on a woman whose profile seemed achingly familiar. "It's her," he whispered, his voice trembling. Eliza stood beside him, her expression soft but resolute. "Then go," she urged gently. "She's right there, Fletcher." His feet stayed rooted to the spot. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "What if she hates me for everything that happened?" Eliza's hand rested lightly on his arm. "You don't know that," she said firmly. "But what I do know is that you've come this far for a reason. Don't let your fear hold you back now." Fletcher swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the woman in the crowd. Memories rushed back. Her comforting voice, the way she used to hum while cooking, her warm hugs that made everything feel okay. But those memories clashed with the guilt he carried, a weight that felt heavier than the snow pressing against his boots. "I can't," he whispered, taking a step back. "You can," Eliza said, her tone unwavering. "Remember what you told me about holding your sister when she was born? That love doesn't just disappear, Fletcher. It's still there, if you're brave enough to reach for it." Before Fletcher could respond, a loud voice cut through the festive atmosphere. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Silas drawled, stepping into view. His coat was buttoned tightly, but the sharpness in his gaze was colder than the winter air. "Miss Hayes, you've been quite busy meddling where you don't belong." Eliza squared her shoulders, stepping protectively in front of Fletcher. "Meddling?" she retorted. "Helping a family reunite isn't meddling, Silas. It's humanity." Silas's lips curled into a smirk. "Humanity? Is that what you call dragging a kid through a wild goose chase?" You're filling his head with false hope. Fletcher's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped. Silas raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Oh, but I do. You think you're the hero in this story, kid? Newsflash, you're not. You're just a liability." "That's enough," Eliza said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You can try to intimidate me all you want, Silas, but you're not going to stop us." Silas's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he regained his composure. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone icy. "This little charade you're running, it's going to end sooner than you think." As Silas turned and disappeared into the crowd, Fletcher exhaled shakily, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Why does he care so much about stopping us?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "Because he's scared," Eliza said simply. "People like him thrive on control, and we're threatening that." Fletcher nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the crowd. He searched for the familiar figure, his heart pounding as he caught another glimpse of her. She was standing near a small stage, her scarf fluttering gently in the breeze. "It's her," he said again, his voice firmer this time. "Then let's go," Eliza said, her tone encouraging. They wove through the crowd, Fletcher's steps hesitant but determined. As they drew closer, the woman turned slightly, and Fletcher's breath hitched. It was her, his mother. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore lines that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same. "Mom," Fletcher whispered, his voice cracking. But before he could take another step, Silas reappeared, stepping directly into their path. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think this is going to end with a happy little reunion?" Eliza's patience snapped. "Get out of the way, Silas," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You've done enough damage." Silas chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're getting into, Miss Hayes. This isn't about one family, it's about the entire system. And if you think you can outmaneuver me, you're in for a rude awakening." Fletcher's gaze darted between Silas and his mother, who had now turned and was scanning the crowd as though searching for someone. His heart ached with the urge to call out to her, but Silas's imposing presence loomed like a storm cloud. "Eliza," Fletcher said quietly, his voice laced with desperation. "We're not stopping," Eliza said firmly, her eyes locked on Silas. "You can't win, Silas. Not this time." For a moment, it seemed as though Silas might escalate the confrontation, but then he stepped aside with a smirk. "Go ahead," he said. "Let's see how this plays out." Fletcher hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his heart pounding in his chest. His mother's eyes met his, and the world seemed to stop. "Fletch," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mom." Fletcher said, tears streaming down his face. But before they could embrace, a commotion broke out near the stage. Fletcher turned just in time to see Silas smirking, his phone in hand. "Looks like your little reunion might have to wait," he said smugly. The sound of police sirens cut through the air, and Fletcher's heart sank. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, but Fletcher's world narrowed to a single point: the tearful eyes of his mother. She stood frozen across the park, her scarf catching in the winter breeze. The vibrant holiday scene around them blurred into irrelevance. For the first time in years, he felt like the scared little boy she used to comfort, rather than the guilt-ridden teenager he had become. "Eliza," Fletcher whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. What if she doesn't want me?" Eliza placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've carried that fear for too long, Fletcher. Look at her. She's been looking for you, just like you've been searching for her." Before Fletcher could summon the courage to step forward, Silas's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Miss Hayes!" he bellowed, drawing the attention of nearby families. His stride was purposeful as he stormed toward them, a smug expression plastered across his face. "You've crossed the line this time." Fletcher flinched, taking a step back. "What is he doing?" he muttered. "Stirring trouble," Eliza said sharply. "Don't let him distract you. Your mother is right there, Fletcher." Silas reached them, his presence commanding the attention of passers-by. "This woman," he declared, gesturing dramatically to Eliza, "has been meddling in matters she doesn't understand, jeopardizing the integrity of our shelter system." "What are you talking about?" Eliza countered, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Helping people isn't jeopardizing anything. It's fixing what your negligence broke." Silas's smirk deepened. "Negligence? Hardly. The system works when people stay within its bounds. What you're doing here is reckless." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd, their holiday cheer overshadowed by the unfolding confrontation. Fletcher's mother took a tentative step closer, her eyes darting between Silas and Fletcher, recognition dawning on her face. "Fletch!" she called, her voice trembling with hope. Fletcher froze. His mother's voice, so familiar yet distant, sent a jolt through him. His chest tightened as the memories flooded back. The warmth of her embrace, the sound of her laughter, the way she used to sing him to sleep. But those memories were tainted by the accident, the guilt he had carried since that day. "She knows you," Eliza said softly. "She's been waiting for this moment as much as you have." Fletcher took a tentative step forward, but Silas shifted to block his path. "Let's not make this messier than it already is," Silas said, his tone patronizing. "The system has protocols for a reason. If you start bending the rules for one case, you'll unravel everything." "Unravel?" Eliza snapped, her patience wearing thin. "The only thing unraveling here is your facade, Silas. Everyone can see this isn't about protocol, it's about control." "Control?" Silas barked out a laugh. "You think I'm the problem? This whole system is broken because of people like you. Idealists who think they can save everyone without understanding the cost." Fletcher's mother stepped closer, her hand clutching her scarf tightly. "Fletch, is that really you?" she asked, her voice breaking. Fletcher's breath hitched. He wanted to run to her, to tell her how much he missed her, but the weight of his guilt held him back. "What if she blames me?" he whispered to Eliza. "She doesn't," Eliza said firmly, "and you'll never know if you don't try." Before Fletcher could move, Silas's voice rose again, this time dripping with venom. "You want to know why this case dragged on so long?" he sneered. "It wasn't the system, it was me. I made sure it stayed buried. Why? Because cases like this never end well." The crowd gasped, the revelation hanging heavy in the frosty air. Fletcher's mother's eyes widened in shock, her gaze snapping to Silas. You did this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Silas shrugged, unapologetic. "It was for the best. The system doesn't have room for lost causes." "You had no right!" Fletcher's mother cried, her voice rising with anger. "He's my son!" The words cut through Fletcher like a knife, shattering the walls he had built around his heart. His mother didn't blame him. She had been fighting for him all along. Fletcher took a shaky step forward, his eyes locked on his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. Her face crumpled with emotion, and she took a step toward him. But before they could close the gap, Silas raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone dismissive. "Reunite if you want. Just don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." Fletcher's mother ignored him, her focus entirely on her son. "Fletch, it's really you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's me," Fletcher said, his own tears spilling over. They were just steps away from each other when the sound of a megaphone blared, interrupting the moment. "Everyone please clear the area," a stern voice commanded. A group of uniformed officers moved into the park, their presence adding a new layer of tension. "What now?" Eliza muttered, her frustration mounting. Silas's smirk returned, his phone visible in his hand. "Just ensuring public safety," he said smugly. Fletcher's mother looked panicked, her eyes darting between the officers and her son. "Don't let them take him," she pleaded with Eliza. "I won't," Eliza promised, her mind racing for a solution. Fletcher stood frozen, his hope dangling by a thread as the officers approached. The crowd began to disperse, the holiday cheer replaced by unease. "Mom," he said again, his voice filled with desperation. "Stay with me, Fletch," she said, reaching for him. The officer stepped between them, their presence a physical barrier that neither could cross. The cold air felt sharper as the tension in the park grew thick. Fletcher stood paralyzed, the officer's presence looming, his mother's tearful gaze locked on his. Before anyone could say another word, a voice broke through the crowd, a voice so familiar yet tinged with the maturity of years past. "Fletcher!" It was his sister, clutching a small, worn toy bunny to her chest. Her breath fogged in the cold as she darted past the officers. "I knew it was you." The sight of her made Fletcher's knees weak. "Hannah," he whispered, disbelief mixing with a wave of emotion that left him frozen in place. She stopped just inches away, holding out the bunny he thought he'd lost forever. "We never stopped looking for you," she said, her voice cracking. "I kept this. I knew you'd want it back." The toy, with its tattered ears and faded fabric, was a relic of simpler times. Fletcher stared at it, his throat tightening as years of guilt bubbled to the surface. I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he admitted, his voice trembling. Hannah's eyes glistened. "We've been searching, Fletcher. Every day, every lead. Mom never gave up on you." Their mother stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Fletch, none of this was your fault," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We've been so worried, sweetheart. We just wanted you home." "I thought—" Fletcher choked on the words, his chest heaving as the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him. "I thought you'd hate me. It was my fault, the accident. I shouldn't have been there." "No," his mother said, cupping his face with her hands. "It wasn't your fault. You were a child, Fletcher, a scared child in the wrong place at the wrong time. None of this is on you." The crowd around them, drawn by the commotion, began to murmur. The emotional reunion struck a chord with onlookers, and soon whispers turned to questioning glances aimed at Silas. "He's just a kid," someone in the crowd muttered. "What kind of system lets families get torn apart like this?" another asked. Eliza, standing at Fletcher's side, saw the tide turning. She turned her gaze to Silas, whose smug expression faltered as the murmurs grew louder. "You've spent so much time blaming the system, Silas," Eliza said, her voice steady. "But this was personal." Silas's face darkened. "Don't try to paint me as the villain here, Miss Hayes," he snapped. "The system is flawed. This is just one of many cases that fell through the cracks." A man in the crowd holding a smartphone aloft called out, "We all heard you admit you delayed his case. Care to explain that, Mr. Silas?" Silas's composure slipped further. "I did what I thought was best," he said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. "The system isn't equipped to handle cases like his. I made a judgment call." "That's not a judgment call, it's negligence," Eliza countered, stepping closer. "You didn't just fail Fletcher, you failed his family, this community, and the very system you claim to protect." The crowd stirred, their holiday cheer replaced with righteous indignation. A reporter pushed through, her camera trained on Silas. "Is this how the shelter system operates?" she asked pointedly. "Delaying reunifications for personal biases?" Silas's jaw tightened. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said tersely. "I stand by my actions." But the crowd wasn't buying it. A man in the back shouted, "We need people who care about families, not bureaucrats who play God." Amid the uproar, Fletcher clutched the toy bunny tightly, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted to come home," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." His mother pulled him into her arms, her voice fierce with emotion. "You're home now, Fletcher, that's all that matters." Hannah wrapped her arms around them both, her small frame trembling with the force of her tears. "We're together again," she whispered. "Nothing else matters." Eliza watched the scene with a mix of relief and resolve, but her focus returned to Silas, who stood rigid, his face pale under the scrutiny of the crowd and the reporter's relentless camera. "This isn't over," Silas muttered, his voice low but venomous. He turned abruptly, his coat flaring as he stormed off. "You'll regret this, Hayes, mark my words." As he disappeared into the crowd, Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She glanced at Fletcher and his family, their embrace a stark contrast to Silas's bitterness. For a moment, hope outshone despair, but she knew Silas's threat wasn't idle. The crowd began to disperse, but the questions lingered. Eliza noticed the reporter speaking into her microphone, her coverage sure to cast a harsh spotlight on the system Silas claimed to defend. Fletcher pulled back slightly from his mother, his face still streaked with tears. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small. Eliza knelt beside him, her gaze steady. "Now we fight, together." Fletcher nodded, clutching the toy bunny like a lifeline. His mother and sister flanked him, their presence a shield against the storm that loomed on the horizon. The snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the park. But within the quiet, the resolve of a reunited family burned brightly, ready to face whatever came next. The warmth of Fletcher's family reunion lingered, even as the chill of Silas's threats loomed over them. Snowflakes swirled under the park's holiday lights, and the chatter of the dispersing crowd was punctuated by whispers of Silas's confession. Eliza stood firm, watching Silas retreat, her mind already racing to plan their next steps. "This is far from over," she murmured to herself, her resolve hardening. Fletcher's mother turned to Eliza, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "You've done so much for us already. I don't even know how to thank you." Eliza shook her head. "This isn't just about Fletcher, it's about every family Silas has hurt. If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing this." Fletcher, clutching the toy bunny, glanced up. "But how do we stop someone like him? He's got power, connections. People listen to him." Eliza placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes it takes one voice to inspire many. Your story, Fletcher, it's not just yours anymore. It's the community's." Her words hung in the frosty air, planting seeds of determination in Fletcher. He exchanged a glance with his mother and sister, their expressions reflecting the same spark of resolve. They weren't just victims anymore, they were advocates. The next day, Eliza, Fletcher, and his family gathered at the community shelter, now abuzz with activity. Word of Silas's actions had spread quickly, galvanizing the staff and volunteers. The shelter's director, a kind but weary woman named Linda, greeted them with a hopeful smile. "I've never seen this place so alive," Linda said, gesturing to the bustling room. "It's like everyone's ready to fight for something." Eliza nodded. "We have to act fast. Silas is already trying to bury this. But if we can gather enough evidence, witness accounts, financial records, anything, we can force the system to hold him accountable." Linda hesitated. "It won't be easy. He's been in this game a long time, and he knows how to cover his tracks." "That's why we need the community," Eliza said firmly. "If we show a united front, he won't stand a chance." Fletcher found himself drawn into the shelter's rhythm, his nervousness slowly giving way to purpose. He helped organize donations, his hands brushing against worn coats and toys that reminded him of his own struggles. Each item told a story, and for the first time, he felt connected to something larger than himself. As he worked, he noticed a group of children gathered around a small table, their laughter echoing through the room. One boy clutched a stuffed bear missing an eye, and Fletcher's chest tightened. He approached the group, kneeling to their level. "Hey," he said softly, "what's your bear's name?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with curiosity. "It's Buddy. He's been through a lot, but he's tough." Fletcher smiled. "Sounds like Buddy's got a lot in common with you." The boy beamed, and Fletcher felt a pang of recognition. He saw himself in the child's hopeful gaze, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how far he still had to go. Meanwhile, Eliza worked tirelessly to rally the community. She organized meetings, drafted petitions, and coordinated with local media to shed light on Silas's corruption. Fletcher's mother and sister joined the effort, sharing their story with anyone who would listen. Their courage inspired others to come forward, creating a ripple effect that began to dismantle the walls of fear and apathy. One evening, as they pored over documents in the shelter's cramped office, Linda burst in, her face alight with excitement. "You won't believe this," she said, waving a folder. "A former staff member from Silas's office just reached out. They have proof, financial records, emails, everything we need to expose him." Eliza's heart raced. "Where are they now?" "They're willing to meet, but they're scared," Linda said. "Silas has a lot of reach. They want assurances they'll be protected." "We'll figure it out," Eliza said, determination gleaming in her eyes. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The next morning, the shelter buzzed with anticipation as word spread about the potential whistleblower. Fletcher, now more confident in his role, stood before a small crowd of volunteers and supporters, his voice steady as he shared his journey. "I used to think I didn't matter," he admitted. "That what happened to me was my fault. But being here, seeing all of you fighting for something bigger, it's shown me that I do matter. We all do." The room erupted into applause, and Fletcher's mother squeezed his hand, her pride evident. Eliza watched from the sidelines, a sense of hope swelling in her chest. They were making progress, not just against Silas, but for every family that had been silenced. Later that evening, Eliza received a call from Linda. "The whistleblower's ready to meet," Linda said. "They've got documents that could bring Silas down." Eliza's pulse quickened. "Where?" Linda gave her an address, and Eliza scribbled it down. "I'll be there," she promised. As she hung up, a chill ran down her spine. This was a turning point, a chance to finally hold Silas accountable. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't go down without a fight. Fletcher approached her, his expression serious. "Whatever happens, we're in this together, right?" "Always," Eliza said, her voice steady. "This is bigger than any one of us. It's about what's right." Fletcher nodded, his resolve mirroring hers. Together, they prepared to take the next step, unaware of the challenges that still lay ahead. The community center's main hall buzzed with tension as people filtered into the public hearing. Folding chairs lined the room, filled with concerned citizens, reporters, and shelter volunteers. At the front, a long table was set up where Silas sat stiffly, his jaw clenched as he avoided the watchful eyes of the audience. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, but none more so than Fletcher. Eliza leaned toward him, her voice low but steady. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Fletcher clutched the microphone in his trembling hands. "I need to," he whispered, determination flickering beneath his fear. "If I don't, who will?" His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her warmth grounding him. "We're right here, Fletcher, no matter what." The chairperson banged the gavel, silencing the murmurs. "This hearing is called to order. Today we'll address allegations of misconduct against Mr. Silas Morgan in relation to the Asheville shelter system." Fletcher stood, his legs unsteady as he approached the podium. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. He adjusted the microphone, his voice cracking as he began. "My name is Fletcher Hayes," he said, his words hesitant at first. "I've been homeless since a car accident separated me from my family. For months I lived on the streets, thinking no one cared, that I didn't matter. But then I met people who believed I did." His gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on Eliza, who gave him an encouraging nod. "The shelter system gave me hope," Fletcher continued, his voice growing stronger. "But it's not perfect. And people like Silas Morgan make it harder for families like mine to stay together." Silas shifted uncomfortably, his expression darkening. Fletcher took a shaky breath. "My story isn't unique. There are so many kids like me, kids who need help, who deserve better. We're not just names on a list or problems to be ignored. We're people." The room erupted into applause, but Fletcher barely noticed. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, his mother pulling him into a tight hug. Silas rose next, his movements stiff and deliberate. The room quieted, all eyes on him. He cleared his throat, his tone defensive. "I won't deny that mistakes were made," he began, his voice icy. "But let's not pretend this system was ever functional. I did what I had to, what no one else was willing to do." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Silas's lips thinned, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You want to know why I've been hard on these shelters? It's because they failed me. Years ago, my own family needed help, and this system, this broken, inefficient system, let us fall through the cracks." His voice cracked, a rare glimpse of vulnerability slipping through. "My brother died waiting for help that never came. So yes, I've been harsh. But maybe that's what this system needs, a wake-up call. The room fell into an uneasy silence, torn between outrage and pity. Eliza's eyes narrowed, her mind racing to connect the dots. Was Silas's vendetta rooted in pain, or was it just another excuse? The chairperson interjected, their tone firm. Mr. Morgan, regardless of your personal grievances, your actions have caused harm to countless families. This hearing is about accountability, not justification. Before Silas could respond, the door at the back of the hall swung open. A reporter entered, holding a tablet aloft. "I have evidence," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "Financial records, emails, proof that Silas misused funds meant for the shelters." Gasps echoed through the room as the reporter handed the tablet to the chairperson. Silas's face paled, his composure cracking. "This is a witch hunt," he spat, his voice rising. "You're all out to get me." The chairperson raised a hand. "That's enough, Mr. Morgan. The evidence will be reviewed, but for now, you are suspended from your duties, effective immediately." Applause thundered through the hall, the crowd rising to their feet in a wave of relief and triumph. Fletcher's family embraced him, their smiles brighter than they'd been in months. But amidst the celebration, Eliza's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped outside, the cold air biting her cheeks as she read the anonymous text. Silas wasn't working alone. Look deeper. Someone bigger is pulling the strings. Her breath hitched, the gravity of the message sinking in. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Returning to the hall, she found Fletcher and his family standing together, their bond stronger than ever. "What's next?" Fletcher asked, his voice steady. Eliza looked at him, her determination mirrored in his eyes. "We keep going," she said, "for every family still waiting for help." The seeds of change had been planted, but the shadows of a larger battle loomed on the horizon. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the shelter's common room, casting soft, golden light over the modest space. Fletcher stood near the window, watching as his mother spoke animatedly with a group of families. Her gestures were confident, her words filled with purpose, something Fletcher hadn't seen in her for a long time. "They're listening to her," he said quietly to Eliza, who was organizing a stack of donated winter coats. "She has a story worth hearing," Eliza replied, glancing at Fletcher. "And so do you." The shelter was bustling that day, filled with children chasing each other, parents catching up, and volunteers arranging tables for the upcoming holiday event. Fletcher's sister, Emma, had taken charge of decorating the shelter's modest Christmas tree, carefully hanging handmade ornaments while chatting with younger children about their favorite holiday traditions. Fletcher found himself in the playroom, surrounded by a group of kids no older than 8. Their wide eyes and curious smiles reminded him of his sister when she was younger. One boy tugged on his sleeve, holding up a crumpled drawing of a family standing under a rainbow. "Do you think my dad will come back?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Fletcher hesitated, the weight of the question pressing on his chest. "I don't know," he admitted, kneeling to the boy's level. "But I do know that people care about you here, and you're not alone." The boy's small hand slipped into Fletcher's, and Fletcher felt a warmth he hadn't known he was capable of offering. Later that afternoon, the family gathered outside near the bridge that connected the shelter to the surrounding neighborhood. The bridge had been damaged in a flood years ago and had only recently been deemed safe for reconstruction. Fletcher watched as workers sanded the beams, preparing to repaint them. "It's like us," Emma said, holding the toy bunny she'd carried for so long. "Broken for a while, but now it's coming back together." Fletcher glanced at Eliza, who was holding a can of paint and a brush. "Want to help?" she asked. Together they painted the words on a sign that would hang at the bridge's entrance. "Every act of kindness builds a bridge." As the paint dried, Fletcher felt an odd sense of peace. For the first time, he wasn't looking back at what he'd lost, but forward to what he could build. Inside the shelter, his mother had started a support group for displaced families. Her voice was steady as she shared their journey, from the car accident that tore them apart to the serendipitous series of events that brought them back together. One by one, other families shared their stories, the room filled with nods of understanding and murmurs of encouragement. "This place," she said, gesturing around her, "is proof that we can come back stronger, not just for ourselves, but for each other." The shelter director approached Emma, who was still holding the toy bunny. "Would you like to add it to our holiday display?" she asked. Emma hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think it'll help someone else now," she said, her voice steady. She placed the bunny on the shelf among other cherished items donated by families who had found hope here. As the day wound down, Eliza's phone buzzed. She stepped into the quiet hallway to take the call, her expression shifting from surprise to thoughtfulness. When she returned, Fletcher was sitting with a group of kids, laughing as he taught them how to fold paper airplanes. "Fletcher," she said, interrupting gently, "that was a call from a community center in Waynesville. They want help setting up a shelter program like this one." Fletcher tilted his head. "And you're going, right?" Eliza smiled, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I can't do it alone," she said. Fletcher hesitated before nodding. "Maybe you don't have to." As they sat in the fading light, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and connection, the air felt lighter than it had in months. But Eliza knew the path ahead would still have its challenges. The shelter hummed with life. Warm light spilled from the windows, cutting through the crisp December night, while laughter and the scent of cinnamon drifted into the snow-covered courtyard. Inside, families gathered around tables adorned with hand-painted centerpieces, and children danced to cheerful holiday tunes playing softly in the background. Fletcher stood near the doorway, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets as he watched the scene unfold. His mother was speaking with a group of volunteers, her voice carrying a tone of gratitude. Emma held a plate of cookies, offering them to the younger children, who eagerly accepted. "They're honoring your family tonight, you know," Eliza said, stepping up beside him. She handed him a steaming cup of cider. "Yeah," Fletcher murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. "It feels strange, I guess." Eliza tilted her head, studying him. Strange good or strange bad? He took a sip of cider, savoring its warmth. Strange. Good. For the first time, I feel like I deserve it. His eyes darted to his mother and sister, and a soft smile spread across his face. Like I'm finally part of something again. As the evening unfolded, Fletcher's family was invited to the front of the room. The shelter director, a kind woman with a deep voice that carried authority and warmth, spoke into the microphone. "Tonight," she began, "we honor a family whose bravery and resilience remind us why we do what we do. Fletcher, Emma, and Mrs. Daniels, your story has inspired not just change, but hope." The room erupted in applause. Fletcher hesitated, his feet glued to the floor, until Emma grabbed his hand and tugged him forward. Standing under the warm glow of the lights, he looked out at the crowd. For the first time, he didn't feel like running. Instead, he felt a swell of pride and belonging. Later, Eliza found herself in the shelter office, tidying up before the night's end. A volunteer knocked lightly on the door, holding a small envelope. "This was left in the donation box," they said. Eliza opened it carefully. Inside was a crisp check for a significant amount, along with a handwritten note. "I know no amount of money can undo the damage I've caused. Please use this to continue the work you've started. I hope one day this system can become what it should have been for my family, and for all families. S." She stared at the signature for a long moment, the weight of Silas's regret evident in every word. When she returned to the main hall, the note still in hand, she found Fletcher helping his sister place the toy bunny back on the holiday display. "Look at this," Eliza said, showing the note to Fletcher's mother. Mrs. Daniels read it silently, then glanced up with a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. "Do you think he means it?" Eliza's brow furrowed. "I don't know, but maybe this is a start." The note quickly made its way through the room, sparking murmurs of debate among the attendees. Some dismissed it as a calculated move to save face, while others saw it as a sign of progress. Fletcher listened quietly, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. "What do you think?" Eliza asked him later, as they stood near the holiday display. Fletcher shrugged. "I think it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what happens next." As the night wound down, the shelter director took the stage once more to announce the next steps for the organization. "Thanks to the generosity of this community and the courage of families like the Daniels, we're proud to announce new leadership for the shelter system, with a focus on transparency and family reunification." The crowd cheered, but Eliza's mind lingered on the anonymous note. As she gathered her things to leave, another volunteer approached her, holding a second envelope. This one was unmarked, and its contents were brief but unsettling. Silas wasn't the only one. "Be careful who you trust." Eliza folded the note, her mind racing with questions. The battle for justice, it seemed, was far from over. The snow fell softly over Asheville, blanketing the city in a pristine white glow. Inside the shelter, the warmth of the room stood in stark contrast to the wintry chill outside. Families gathered around tables, sharing stories and laughter, their faces lit by the flicker of candlelight. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, a subtle reminder of the holiday season. Eliza stood near the doorway, her travel bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people she had come to know so well. This place, this community, had become more than a mission to her. It had become home. But today marked a new beginning, one that would take her to the neighboring town to help establish another shelter program. "Eliza," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Fletcher walking toward her, his smile shy but genuine. Behind him, his mother and sister carried a cake, its frosting adorned with the words, "Thank you for believing." The room erupted into applause as Fletcher gestured for her to join them at the center. Eliza laughed, shaking her head. "You didn't have to do this." "We did," Fletcher said, his voice steady. "Because you believed in us, when I couldn't even believe in myself." The room quieted as Fletcher stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that's happened," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "For so long I thought I didn't deserve anything good. I thought the accident, losing my family, being out on the streets, it was all my fault." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression soft and encouraging. "But then Eliza came along," Fletcher continued, his voice growing stronger. "She showed me that even when things seem broken, when we feel broken, there's still hope. And that hope, it's in the kindness we give and the kindness we accept." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened. Fletcher's words echoed her late mother's philosophy, a lesson she had carried with her through every step of her journey. After the celebration, the group moved to the nearby bridge, a place that had become a symbol of the community's resilience. The bridge, once damaged by a devastating flood, had been lovingly restored by volunteers from the shelter and the town. Its arches now gleamed under the light of the lampposts, casting a golden glow over the snow. Fletcher and his family carried a small plaque, its inscription simple yet profound. "Dedicated to all the families who found their way back to one another. Every act of kindness builds a bridge." As they secured the plaque to the railing, the crowd cheered, their voices ringing out into the stillness of the night. Eliza stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold with a deep sense of fulfillment. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Fletcher approached her. "Are you sure you have to go?" he asked, his tone tinged with reluctance. Eliza smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "There's more work to be done," she said gently. "But this, what you've built here, it's going to last. And that's because of you." Fletcher nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You'll come back, right?" "I will," Eliza promised. "But only if you keep believing in yourself and keep helping others do the same." As the night drew to a close, Eliza found herself standing alone on the bridge. The city stretched out before her, the snow falling softly against the backdrop of twinkling lights. She could almost hear her mother's voice, a whisper carried on the wind. "Every act of kindness builds a bridge. Keep building." She smiled, her heart swelling with purpose. This was not the end of her journey, only the beginning of a new chapter. With one last look at the bridge, she turned and walked away, ready to carry her mother's legacy of hope to wherever it was needed most. As Eliza's journey comes to a close, this story reminds us of a powerful truth. Small acts of kindness can build bridges in even the most broken places. Fletcher's transformation, from a boy weighed down by guilt to someone who believes in his own worth, teaches us that hope and healing often come from connections we make with others. Eliza's unwavering support shows the importance of standing by those in need, even when the path forward seems uncertain. But what about you? Have you ever witnessed or been part of a moment where kindness changed someone's life? What do you think we, as a community, can do to support individuals facing similar struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire someone else. If you found this story moving, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, courage, and hope. Together, let's continue to explore the impact of kindness and the incredible ways it can shape the world around us. See you in the next story.